see that this session was called Community Life and Mission Towards a Future Full of Hope. And I thought, what a wonderful defiant ring this is, a future full of hope. And I thought until I arrived in Chicago yesterday that really religious life had a pretty dismal future here as in the West. And I've had to change my mind a bit. First of all, because I had a drink with one of our young friars in Chicago who's promoter of vocations for the Central Province. And he said, it's not true religious life is dying in the States. He said, lots of congregations are getting vocations. And this was news to me. I mean, I knew we were lucky, but I didn't realize that actually it's part of a new pattern. In Europe, it's not so. There are very few vocations indeed. Actually, Dominicans are a little bit of an exception. We do get young people. But generally speaking, the future is dismal. So I think I would have prepared this lecture differently. And then I look around at you. And I see that many of you are, in fact, younger. And I think that there is more of a promise than I realized. And so this isn't quite so defiant as I hoped. And my thesis for this afternoon is fundamentally that if people see that religious life is a life, it's a sharing in the God's abundant life, then we may well indeed attract vocations. This doesn't mean to say that if you're not attracting vocations, you're dead. It may be because your mission's achieved. It may be because your charism is so antithetical to the time that it's harder to attract. All I'm saying is that if we are alive in a way that's puzzling, intriguing, provocative, we may well draw vocations. And if we don't, it's not our fault. You know that wonderful saying of St. Irenaeus in the 2nd century, Gloria Dei vivens homo. The glory of God is a human being alive. When Thomas Merton went to Bangkok, when he was electrocuted in the shower, his last known words before he disappeared were to a friend who asked him, why didn't he push Christianity a bit more? And he said, these are the last known words of Thomas Merton, one of my big heroes. He said, I think it's more important for us so to let God live in us that others may feel God and come to believe in God because they feel how God is alive in us. I need some water, otherwise I won't be alive much longer. I was attracted to the order, as I've often said, by the motto, truth. But one of the reasons that I took the plunge was when I went and stayed with the brethren. I went down to the novitiate house in train. Well, you won't believe this, well-dressed, suit, tie, umbrella, briefcase, rather like something from Downton Abbey. And I was met at this station by two rather scruffy friars wearing jeans and duffel coats. It was the novice master and his assistant. But I think what drew me into the order, what cemented, if you want, the attraction, was the feeling that they're alive. You could talk about anything. Nobody was shocked. You could laugh and share the rather disgusting homemade beer. And we cannot be ambassadors for the God of life unless we're seen to be alive, to have a life. In his T.S. Eliot, I've just spotted a nice quote. T.S. Eliot said, "Life you may evade, death you cannot." We mustn't evade life. Thomas Merton, in his novel, which I bet none of you have read, called My Argument with the Gestapo, said, "If you want to identify me, ask me not where I live, or what I like to eat, or how I comb my hair." People are always asking me that. But ask me what I am living for, in detail, and ask me what is keeping me from living fully for the thing that I want to live for. If we make survival our goal, then we won't. Jesus didn't say, "I have come that you may survive and survive abundantly." It's not worth joining a congregation to let it stagger on for a few more years. Most of our congregations are going to die. 70%, they say, of all the congregations that were alive at the end of the 14th century were dead by the end of the beginning of the 17th century. That's how it is. That's how it's always been. Extinction doesn't mean failure. It might mean mission complete. One of my first jobs as provincial was to go and visit one of our last monastery of contemplative nuns in England. And I went with the former provincial, who was called Peter. It was at a place called Carisbrooke. There were 4 ancient nuns left. Well, 3 ancient nuns and 1 not so ancient. And one of them said to me, because they had to vote to finish the monastery, and one of them said to me, "But Timothy, our dear Lord wouldn't want Carisbrooke to die, would he?" And Peter, the previous provincial, he said, "Sister, he let his son die. He let his son die." And I think very often the way we face death individually, even corporately, is our final and best preaching. You know, with some of the brethren, it's the only decent sermon they ever give. Speaking as a member of the Order of Preachers. So how can we flourish in this time of crisis? I had the great good fortune to join the English province of the Order of Preachers at the time of its greatest crisis since the Reformation. The numbers had been growing slowly and steadily until the day I joined. And then they started to collapse rapidly. This was the mid-60s. I told everybody, it's not my fault. You know, post hoc, non ergo propter hoc. In my 1 year of novitiate, do you know we had 6 novice masters? This was a world record. 2 of whom got married. The day I joined, we had 42 in formation. 1 year later, we had 9. It was a massive crisis. I remember when we buried one of the brethren, we all gathered around the grave, and one whispered to another, "Well, that's an unusual way to leave the order." But we lived through the crisis. And now we're greatly renewed. Now the average age of the province is 54. Actually, I think it's a bit lower now. Will be when I die, anyway. And I think one of the most important lessons for me, which I never cease to repeat endlessly, so forgive me if you've heard it before, is that crises are not to be feared. Crisis is how human beings grow up. You know, we all start with the great initial crisis of birth, expelled from the lovely warm jacuzzi of the mother's womb, out into the cold world. But if we didn't live through that crisis, we'd never see our mother's face, and we would never grow into an adult love. And then we have to go through the crisis of weaning, being taken away from the breast, so we can sit down at the table and begin to grow yet further into an adult relationship. And we go through the crisis of puberty, you know, hormones going all over the place. We men get squeaky voices, trying to adapt to a body that feels the wrong shape. You go through the crisis of leaving home, whether to study, to join a congregation, to get married, and finally, of course, you have the crisis of death. That's how human beings grow up. We grow up through crisis. And if you don't have any crises, God bless you. You need them. And God works in the rhythms of human life. And if you look at the history of salvation, it's one damn crisis after another. It's expulsion, it's flood, it's Babel, it's exile, it's the destruction of the kingdom, the destruction of the temple, exile again. It's loss and crisis. Until we come to the biggest crisis of all, the night before Jesus died, when there was no future. He was betrayed, he was denied, everybody was about to run away. And that's our sacrament of hope. So, religious life is going through a crisis. Thanks be to God. That's just fine. If we didn't go through crisis from time to time, we would be like the child that never dared to leave the womb, or the kid that refused to go through puberty, or the person who never dares to die. We all live through crisis. And the only thing is how to do it fruitfully. I was banging on to my brethren about this in America once, and they made me a T-shirt which said, "Have a good crisis." Another T-shirt, which I seem to have mysteriously outgrown. And so how do we live through crisis, this crisis, fruitfully? I think if you look at the history of religious life, you see that it always happens when we stop being preoccupied principally by ourselves and see the crisis of our society and our people. Then we flourish. Religious life in the West looks back to St. Benedict of Nursia, the founder of Western monasticism. In the middle of the crisis of the collapse of Western civilization, in the face of the barbarian invasions. And it was really Benedict that provided the extraordinary way through. Alistair MacIntyre, a wonderful book, After Virtue, in which he longs for another Benedict. Or if you look at the 13th century, I'll just plonk in here and there, with the friars, the Franciscans and the Dominicans and the Augustinians and the Carmelites. We responded to the great crisis of the 13th century, the development of new towns and the new universities, a whole shift, a focus of society. Magna Carta, the year before the foundation of the Dominican order, the new urge for democracy. And so we responded to this critical moment we flourished. Or if you look at the Reformation and the Renaissance, a whole new way of being a human being, a new personalism, a new individualism. It led to the foundation of the Jesuits, the Ursulines, the Capuchins, or zoom forward to the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, the new poverty and wealth, the crisis of these great new megacities, Chicago, for example. You see the foundation of hundreds of new congregations responding to the crisis. If we get wrapped up in ourselves and try to just survive, we'll die, and we will deserve to. So what are the crises that we're living through to which we must respond? According to the United Nations, there are some 50 million homeless refugees at the moment, looking for somewhere to live. 1 million of them arrived in Germany this year. Many of them are headed to the United Kingdom and the United States. Will we respond? Will we be there? You see the rise of religious fundamentalism. Fundamentalist, not I think because it's religious, but fundamentalist because fundamentalism is a characteristic of modernity, from scientific fundamentalism to market fundamentalism. You see the rise of religious violence. Will we be there? Will we respond? You see the threat of ecological catastrophe, which Pope Francis has pointed to, Laudato Si. Will we be there? If we are in these places of suffering and pain, forgetting ourselves largely, we may well flourish. And if we don't, it's not our fault. And what I want to suggest is that each of the great vows, traditional vows of religious life, embody a promise to our society. They say something beautiful of hope to our people. Because the vows touch the very core of our humanity. A friend of mine who's a Jesuit, yes, we do have Jesuit friends, the Bishop of Port Pirie in Australia, he said beautifully, poverty being all that I have, chastity being all that I am, and obedience all that I will ever be. Chastity. Do you know the interesting study by Sister Mary Johnson, among others, a new generation of Catholic sisters, published, 2 or 3 years ago. And she argues that for men, this is the great challenge. Oh, that looks wonderful. Barbara knows that I like my gin and tonic strong. For many people in our society, the vow of chastity really is incomprehensible. Not just because it implies that we don't have sex, but because it seems opposed to the transmission of life. Here we have the Catholic Church banging on about being pro-life, priests and religious telling us we've all got to have lots of babies, and then we promise not to have any. A friend of mine, Monsignor Mike Hare of the Orange Diocese in California, describes beautifully how he got a summer job as a seminarian, and slowly it dawned on people that he was going to promise to renounce sex. And he said, they kept asking, what, never? Not ever, ever? And finally one of them sidled up to him and said, well, maybe if you never not evered, you could never not ever. But if you've ever evered, you could not never ever. Which boils down to, if you've not had sex, you don't know what you're missing. This is decreasingly true of people joining religious life today. So how is the vow of chastity an immense sign of hope for the whole of our society? That could be a whole lecture, rather than just about a quarter. Bertrand Russell, the atheist philosopher, said, if you can put something in a nutshell, don't. Well, in a nutshell, I think that marriage and the vow of chastity are complementary signs of the mystery of God's love, which is both particular and universal. I've written an article which has been published in Horizon about this, which is why I don't have to go on about it too long. God's love is particular. He doesn't love us in general. He loves each of us totally. As one of my heroes, Greg Boyle, says in his study of his report of his life with the drug gangs, God is the one who's head over heels with each of those kids. He's the one who says, I can't take my eyes off you. And marriage is a sign, a sacrament of that particular love. I presided at the marriage of a nephew of mine a couple of years ago, and I could see in their love the sacrament of God's particular love for each of us. Now that particular love has to open out, expand, become more universal, as it does when they have children, when they welcome in odd bods and friends, people like us, to share their home. That love must grow, expand, but it remains rooted in particularity. And we're the other way around. We're a sign of God's wide open, spacious, generous love from which nobody's excluded. The love that has a place for everybody, especially the deprived, the marginal, the people of no account. This doesn't get us off loving in particular. You know, when I was a young fry, many orders, people were taught, oh, beware of particular friendships. Well, I was taught by an old friar called Gervase Matthew, one of the Inklings, you know, with Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And he always used to say, oh, but dear Timothy, beware of particular enmities. But that's another lecture. That's another lecture I would happily give. So I think our vow of chastity is a vast expression of hope for humanity, because it speaks of a love from which no one is excluded. This is deeply countercultural. The vow of chastity is countercultural, not just because it's a renunciation of sex, more radically because it's the promise to love people who are different. And our society, Western society, fears difference. Richard Sennett of New York University said, we're highly tribalized. Tribalism coupled with solidarity with others like yourself is an aggression against those who are different. I think the whole of internet, which I love and I use 50 times a day, but the temptation of the world of the web is to be close only to those who are like-minded. And if you disagree, you disengage in a second. And when we believe that we do cope with difference it's by pretending it doesn't exist. I don't know, Brits and Americans, we're all the same. We're not. Men and women, young and old, gay and straight. The beauty of our society is that we're not the same. Thanks be to God. How boring it would be if we were all the same. In a few days ago, I explained in Dominican University how in November I was in Syria, and my base was a monastery where we came back to every night, halfway between Damascus and Homs. I was on a little delegation led by the famous Mairead Maguire, who ran the Nobel Peace Prize with Betty Corrigan for her work in Northern Ireland. On the west, the monastery is about 2 or 3 miles from the front line with ISIS. And on the east, it varies 10 to 15 miles away. So they are pretty well surrounded by ISIS. At night, it's difficult to sleep because of the gunfire. There's an artillery emplacement about 50 yards away from my bedroom. And all night long there was fighting. And I must say, you'd be surprised to hear this, at times I longed for the gun to go off, because I was sharing a room with an Anglican clergyman who snored heroically. It used to begin with a snuffle, and then it became a sort of grunting, and then it graduated to a leaf blower, and finally it was a pneumatic drill. And I saw the attraction of celibacy. And the only time he ever stopped was when the guns went off. There'd be a burst of artillery fire, and he would wake up for 5 minutes. Sometimes say, "Will somebody fire those bloody guns, please?" And in the middle of all this conflict, there was this community. Mainly men, but some women. Mainly Catholic, but some Orthodox. From Venezuela and Chile, from Belgium and France and Palestine, and one young graduate from Princeton, America. And when it was time for prayer, the bell used to ring out defiantly. And I used to think that bell will be heard in the trenches of ISIS. At one stage, ISIS took it over, captured the village just to the south, Kara. And they destroyed the monasteries, they dug up the graves, they threw the bones around, burnt the church. But the Muslims welcomed us into the mosque for Christmas. And now we celebrate Christmas in the mosque and the birth of Muhammad in the church. And the women come up to learn to make candles with the sisters. And the men work in the orchards with the monks. And this little community, which embraces so much difference, is a sort of sign of hope for a world which is divided. It's a sign of a love that overthrows division and boundaries. It's a sort of sign of the peace of God, where the lion will lie down with the lamb, and the child will play over the hole of the viper. So in a society which I think is deeply fearful of difference, chastity is a sign of a love which breaks through the boundaries of the like-minded. My most radical experience, apart from in Syria in November, was in Burundi during the civil war, when many of the brothers and sisters were scattered, and I would travel around the very little country with the local superior, who was Tutsi, and my Sochius and the General Council, who was Hutu. And every evening, the three of us, wherever we were, often by the side of a road, we'd celebrate the Eucharist, the sign of a love which had the place for all of us. Now, in that interesting study, new generations of Catholic sisters, do you know what the biggest difference that we have to cope with? The most difficult? It's the difference of generations. Because you get the war generation, the baby boomers, Generation X, the millennials, and now we have the next generation. I don't think they've found a name for it yet. Those who were born after 1996. And the older generations probably tend to stress faith sharing, and the younger generations, Eucharistic adoration. And the older generations have shed the habit, and the younger often want to put it back on. It's tough. We tread on each other's toes, but we should be a sign of that love which crosses the boundaries. It's my experience in the Dominican order. If I look at all the 70 or so provinces and vice provinces in the order, the ones that are surviving and thriving are the ones where they're unafraid of the young being different. Chastity is a protest against ideological narrowness. I live in a community in Oxford of 24 friars, were atypical in the Catholic Church in Britain, and that were average age is about 35. Many of these young guys are in their 20s and 30s. And it is an immense joy to live with them. But sometimes it's jolly tough. And what I would say to people of my generation is let the young be different. Trust them. Let them overthrow what we've built and do it differently. When one of my younger brethren, not much, just after me, made solemn profession, I remember the provincial, who was a sturdy Scotsman, a convert from Presbyterianism, and he said something like this. I haven't got the quote in front of me. He said, all my religious life, and it's been a long one, I have built up things which I hoped would endure. I have made monuments that I hoped would be a sign for the future, and inevitably some idiot has come along and torn them down. So what I say to you today is God will frustrate your plans. Well, not being a convert from Presbyterianism, I wouldn't put it quite like that. But we have to trust the young to be different. And the young must trust us in our way. Teilhard de Chardin said, the future belongs to those who give the next generation reason to hope. So chastity speaks of our hope for all human beings, not just for us. Our hope for all human beings, of that ultimate, wide, spacious love in which we will all have a part. Marriage does too, but differently. And then there's obedience, the only vow that we Dominicans take explicitly. Often, the young friars, when I was provincial, would say to me, I'm just going away for the weekend. Does that mean I can get dispensed from chastity? No. And this is a vow which is equally incomprehensible to our contemporaries. It looks like a refusal to grow into adult freedom. According to that study by Sister Mary Johnson, this is the biggest challenge for women. I suspect it's because most male religious are priests and so have an identity and a status which is separately established, which makes it actually easiest for us to cope with the whims of superiors. Though there was an Irish Dominican provincial who was called Father Coffey, and he was very inclined to send out assignations to the brethren, many of them a day, sometimes to different places in the same day, without obviously any reflection at all. And so Father Coffey was known in the Irish province as Instant Coffee. So if chastity speaks of the ultimate destiny of all human beings to be taken up into a love which is wide and spacious, obedience speaks of the journey there. Somehow it shapes our journeys towards the kingdom, the summons. Obedience is the promise to go on listening, as you've got to do, I'm afraid, to this lecture. To go on listening, to go on hearing the invitation to make the next step. When the young Anglican, John Henry Newman, was stranded off Sicily in 1833, he was sick, he didn't know the way forward, he couldn't see the shape of his life, he couldn't see where anything was going. And he composed that famous hymn, "Lead, kindly light, amidst the encircling gloom, lead thou me on. The night is dark and I am far from home, lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet. I do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for me. Meanwhile, along the narrow, rugged path thyself hast trod, lead, Saviour, lead me home in childlike faith, home to my God, to rest forever after earthly strife." The vow of obedience is the trust that our life is shaped towards that end, when everything will make sense. It's strange, we have an incredible sense of time. More than any other generation. We know that the world is approximately 13.5 billion years old. We know that the evolution of human beings stretches over hundreds of millions of years. And yet we have an incredibly short time span for the present. So politicians think just of the next election, and bankers often just of the next profit, and businesses, of the next return. Media think in terms of the next deadlines. Obedience is the confidence that we can think long term, and our lives as a whole have sense. And if we attend to the Lord and to each other, we'll discover the way forward. Every morning we sing the invitatory, that wonderful song, "Harden not your hearts, listen to his voice." And we're like the Israelites wandering around in the desert, not knowing quite how to get out of it, but trusting we'll hear the voice, we'll find the way. That's obedience, that attentiveness. In the General Council, when I was Master of the Order, we eventually discovered that it wasn't our job to know where we're going. All we had to know was the next step. Know the next step. So chastity points to the end, and obedience shapes the journey. It is the virtue of the pilgrim. If chastity is the promise of a love that transcends difference, obedience teaches us how to negotiate difference with loving intelligence. Often in the past, mistakenly, I think, we've thought that obedience is being prepared to do ridiculous things just because your superior told you. Mindless submission. So when Teresa of Avila commanded a nun to plant a wilted cucumber lengthwise in the sun so that it would probably shrivel and die, that was seen as a good obedience. It's the sort of obedience that gives religious life a bad name. As St. Teresa, that most intelligent woman, surely knew. I remember 40 years ago, 50 years ago, my community in Oxford, we began to give out communion under both kinds. And it was rather earlier than most places in Britain. I'm sure in the States you'd already been doing it. And we got a letter from this formidable Archbishop of Birmingham, George Patrick Dwyer, and he said, "I hear you're giving out the chalice. You are to stop." So we had a community meeting, and we thought, and we wrote back, "Your Grace, we all quite understand your concerns, but this is an extremely important pastoral matter. We would like to meet you to discuss with it." He wrote a second letter. "Do you Dominicans not know the meaning of obedience? I said stop." We had another chapter meeting. We thought, we wrote back and we said, all we want to do is to talk to you about it. And he wrote back a third letter and he said, "Oh, go on and do whatever you want then." Anything rather than talk. And I think that today we're rediscovering a more ancient understanding of obedience. St. Thomas Aquinas, bring him in, St. Thomas Aquinas taught that obedience is primarily a virtue of the mind and not of the will. It's founded on intelligent listening to each other. Herbert McCabe says, obedience is only perfect when the one who commands and the one who obeys come to share one mind. The notion of blind obedience makes no more sense in our tradition than blind learning. The perfect obedience of Jesus Christ to his Father wasn't a robotic mindlessness. It was utter mutuality. It's said of Herbert McCabe that when he was a little kid, I think he was 6 or 7 years old, his baptismal name was John. And his mother said he did something very wicked. And his mother said, "John, you've been a very bad boy. What you've done is so bad, it might almost be a mortal sin." And little 6-year-old John said, "Mother, according to the teaching of the church, I cannot commit a mortal sin until I attain the age of reason." Which I have not done so yet, and therefore your reasoning is false. Obedience is the promise to attend to each other with all your intelligence, with all your empathy, with all your imagination, especially to those whose views seem incomprehensible and foolish. I remember the general chapter of the Friars, Lord, we're creeping on. We'll have to bring this to a speedy end. Otherwise, disobedience will be widespread. I remember the general chapter of the Friars in Krakow, about 6 years ago. We had a bit of a conflict. Why have general chapters if you don't have conflict? And some of the friars who drew up the document on preaching stressed dialogue, listening, the preacher must be the one who learns and all that. And this was vigorously objected to by some other friars who said, but our job as preachers is to preach the truth. And what we discovered was how the friars came from different backgrounds. Those who stressed dialogue were principally friars growing up in Asia, where Christianity is a tiny minority, where you have to learn. Dialogue is preaching, as the bishops of India said. Dialogue is preaching. Preaching is dialogue. And the ones who were objecting vigorously mainly came from Central and Eastern Europe. And they'd been imprisoned for their faith. If you've been in prison for 10 years for your faith, you're not going to come bursting out of prison wanting to have a nice dialogue with your people who imprisoned you. So we saw that actually the process of obedience requires long-term listening, attending to what the other person has lived, getting in under their skin, learning what they have experienced. And this gives me just 2 minutes for a very, very short word on poverty. Chastity is a sign of the goal. Obedience shapes the journey, breaks through the barriers, and poverty lightens the step for the kingdom. At the Synod of Religious Life in 1993, was it, or 94, Cardinal Etchegaray, great French cardinal, he said of religious, I ask only one thing of you, be poor. If you want religious life to be renewed, embrace poverty. And I think very few of us in the West are really poor. I know a lot of poor religious in the developing world, but not so many here. A friend of mine, not a friend of mine, somebody I know, who was a rich banker, and she joined a religious life in England to embrace poverty, and she found out that she was better off in the order than she had been before. I think at least let us hope that we have simple lives which challenge the illusions, the seductions of consumerist society. Our society is always trying to persuade us that happiness is a big sports car or vast amounts of money or a massive mansion. Once in San Francisco, I was hearing confessions in a school, and they said there are some Jewish and Muslim kids who'll come in. Obviously they don't want to go to confession, but they're like a little prayer together. And there was this lovely little Jewish kid called Sam, and we had a wonderful chat. And as he went out, I said, Sam, say a prayer for me. And he turned around and he said, Lord of heaven and earth, grant to Father Timothy an enormous mansion and a very big car. To be honest, I grew up in, I suppose, what would be called relative wealth. And I became a friar because I wanted more. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry said, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up people to collect wood, and don't assign them tasks and work, but teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. Poverty is about learning to desire more, deepening desire, resisting the seductions of the superficial things. Sister Margaret Atkins wrote, advertising aims to break the link between goods and their real purpose. The car is no longer for getting to work, but for attracting nubile young women, or racing across empty deserts, or making your peers jealous. The simple life simplifies desire, intensifies it, liberates us from the seduction of consumerism. So I think it's time to stop. So religious life, I think, with its crazy vows, embodies a vibrant invitation to our contemporaries to live. Not to relive the religious life, but to live. Moses says to the people of Israel, I put before you life and death. Choose life. And I think our vows actually have value only as saying something about what it means to be alive. And chastity shows the way to a love in which we dare to transcend difference. And obedience shapes us as pilgrims on the way. And poverty helps us to shed what burdens us as we travel. Thank you.